An interesting feature about the Gospels is you'll be hard-pressed to find any place in them where Jesus gives anyone a guarantee for salvation. Now, some might say, especially our non-denominational Christian friends, that there are a number of times in the Gospel of John where Jesus says, if you believe in the name of the Son of Man, you will be saved. But when you look at the context of the various times in which he says that, you add that context to it. You believe in the Son of Man, you will be saved when you eat my flesh and drink my blood. If you don't, you have no life within you. If you believe in the name of the Son of Man, you will be saved if you are born from above through water and the Holy Spirit. And so on and so forth. There really is no place where Jesus says, you've made it. You've done well. You're on your way. Now, I'll give you one. Some of you might be thinking of it. There is one occasion in which he actually does that. And that is when he says to the good thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise. But like Jesus, the good thief was on death's door. He didn't have much life left to mess it up. But everywhere else, Jesus doesn't give assurances. In one place even, when someone asks him, are they few in number who are to be saved? Jesus' answer, I won't give you all the detail of the answer, but in a nutshell, his answer is, many will try, few will succeed, and you will be left out. Well, thank you, Lord. Try not to be too encouraging here. And he says that to the person who asked the question. And of course, it's not because he's giving us a hopeless situation. He doesn't want us to descend into hopelessness. But he says so as a motivator. And he knows that once we think we're guaranteed and that we've made it, human nature leads to complacency with the real danger of losing our salvation. And we have examples of that in today's gospel as well. At the very end, Jesus says, after you've done all you have been commanded, say we are unprofitable servants. We are worthless servants. We have only done what we have been obliged to do. We are worthless servants if we have only fulfilled our obligations. Again, thanks, Lord. Try not to be too encouraging here. But hopefully it speaks to us very personally because we are of a faith that has obligations. I like to sometimes refer to obligation as being defined as such. Catholics complain about them before they don't do them anyway. All one has to do is look at the attendance at Mass on holy days of obligation. We don't see people coming to Mass as much as they used to on the holy days of obligation. But what are other obligations? Coming to Mass on Sunday, going to confession at least once a year during Lent, days of fasting and abstinence during the season of Lent, and so on and so forth. We have our obligations. But Jesus doesn't want us to be simply doing things simply because there are obligations that we are fulfilling. We're sitting marking time, fulfilling an obligation, checking off a box, we've done this and we've done this. He wants us to do so much more, not motivated by the rules we are commanded to do, but by a desire to truly live that life of faith with the important components that, yes, are obligatory, but hopefully we do out of a desire to do them. And we have many such examples in the Gospels where this is so. One rich young man came to Jesus and said, I have fulfilled all the commandments. And Jesus says, you have one more thing to do. Go sell all you have and give to the poor. To which the apostles said, well, we've given up everything to follow you. And Jesus says, you'll get it back 10 times, 100 times over with persecutions. This to this group of faceless cowards who abandoned him at the first opportunity in the Garden of Gethsemane when things got rough. Always one more thing to do. And in another place, Jesus says in the same passage in which he says, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn and offer them the next. He doesn't stop there, by the way. He goes on. And he says, if someone takes you to court over your coat, give them your shirt as well. If someone presses you into service for 1 mile, go 2 miles. Go over and above what's expected, over and above the command, over and above the obligation. And there's where he will see us as those profitable servants who don't simply do what we've been commanded, who don't simply do the very least we can do, but go even beyond that. And we have many such examples which we can apply, that very basic teaching. For example, we're all here on Sunday, as we are obliged to do, to worship God on Sunday or Saturday evenings. But how many of us here would stop coming if the church came out tomorrow and said it was no longer an obligation to go to Mass on Sunday? We already have many Catholics who don't come even when it is an obligation. The largest single denomination in the United States are Catholics. The second largest denomination are the non-practicing Catholics. But even when we come to celebrate here, how do we celebrate? Do we simply sit there, marking time, checking off the box, fulfilling our obligation, checking our watch to make sure the homily isn't too long, noting when the hour is finished and if Mass is going on longer than perhaps it should? Or are we here fully investing ourselves in the celebration, in how we respond, in how we sing? Do you respond as loudly as you hope to hear the priest who celebrates? Do we participate in the singing? And even those who say, well, I don't sing because I don't have much of a voice, great, sing as loudly as you can. Then the rest of us will want to sing if for no other reason to drown you out. And then we will all be singing together, hopefully over and above the musician and even the priest. With regard to our children, there's one thing I like to remind folks, and don't worry, I think you all know this. Parenthood is not a contemplative vocation. It's a missionary one, in which you as parents introduce the faith and raise your children in that faith. They learn it for the first time. They grow in it from you. Do you simply pray solemnly while your children are fidgety in the seat? Or you go to the mother's room while they play on the floor while you are attending Mass? Or, as I always like to say, kneelers are there to be stood on, at least by the toddlers. And when they're standing and you're kneeling, their ear is on the same level as your mouth, especially during the Eucharistic prayer. An elongated prayer, which the priest does a lot of the work, but how many whisper in your child's ear when he holds up that host, when he holds up that chalice? Jesus is there. Watch for it. Listen for it. Do we go over and above and beyond, simply fulfilling an obligation, even in raising our children? Another example we see, especially during the season of Lent, we have our obligations to the practices and observances in Lent, especially the days of fasting and abstinence. And I always like to say, Lent is a tricky time. Every year for a priest, I always like to say, Catholics do one of two things during the season of Lent, and there's really no gray area. It is one or the other. They either make sacrifices or they make excuses. They either show what good Catholics they are or what good lawyers they are. Because if they don't know the rules or the obligations or the traditions or the practices, they sure as heck know the exceptions. For example, in the days of fasting, which by the way used to be every day during Lent, except for Sunday. Sunday was not a day of fasting. Now we have a grand total of 2 days in which we fast during Lent. And every year I have someone says, well, Father, I'm under 14 years of age, or I'm over 60. I don't have to fast. To which I make the distinction. It's not that you don't have to fast. It's that you are not under obligation. And there's a difference. Do we do things out of obligation, which we have to have Holy Mommy Church hold our hand and tell us to look both ways before we cross the street? Or because we do it out of an innate sense of the importance of these practices? And after all, why should a 14-year-old or younger need an obligation when they have parents who are hopefully teaching them this practice, raising them in the practice, so that when they are under obligation, they've been trained and formed to participate in these practices with the church? And as for the elders in our midst, we kind of have a presumption, maybe it's an unfair one, but a presumption that our elders have a certain spiritual maturity of having done these things all their lives, that they don't need to be belittled with an obligation to do something that's important and be an example to all of us, because they see the importance of these practices that date even before Christianity itself: prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. And how many of us, including myself, know people in their 70s, 80s, even 90s who still fulfill these practices even though they're not under obligation? Another example is from the other great season and feast day during the year, and that is the celebration of Christmas. One of the great holy days of the year and an important day for everybody. It's a very cherished holiday. And it's a day in which we have an obligation to worship, go to Mass, and celebrate the incarnation of Jesus. But when do most Catholics go to Mass at Christmas? They pack the church to the gills at the Christmas Eve Mass. The children's Mass, or the family Mass, however they refer to it, the Vigil Mass. And why do they do that? Well, for many people, it's to get it out of the way. Get it done because Christmas Day is so busy with family and friends and celebrations of Christmas, as we all love to do. But how often do we consider, and perhaps we could this year, consider approaching the Mass in a way that doesn't focus on the obligation, but in the inclusion of the celebration of the Incarnation as an integral and primary part of our celebration of Christmas? Have we ever thought of taking our children, our family, to the midnight Mass or the Mass at night, depending on when it is in a given parish? Not packing the church to get it out of the way at the vigil, but going at a time that's very different, late at night, with the family. There's one family I knew, every year they went to Mass at the midnight Mass at Christmas and the Easter Vigil every year at Easter with their small children. And I remember seeing the dad walking out of the midnight Mass with his little son asleep in his arms, having just finished the midnight Mass. Or, since we all know that the children are getting up bright and early on Christmas Day, have we ever considered this year? This year, when we get up on Christmas Day, we won't open presents right away. Since we're up so bright and early, we'll get up and go to the morning Mass for Christmas. Put Jesus in the front. Put Him primarily as the reason we celebrate Christmas. And we can open presents when we come home from Mass, after we have breakfast as a family. Even small ways in which we go above and beyond just simply fulfilling obligations, but putting Christ, His commands, but His call first and forefront in how we conduct ourselves as people of faith. We don't want Jesus to, in the end, say we are the unprofitable, worthless servants because we only did what we commanded. We don't want to be those who are simply known as marking time, checking boxes, and fulfilling obligations as the only important way in which we live that faith. But let us find ways in which we can go over and above the call of duty, in a way, the command and the obligation, so that we truly make a part of us inside these practices, values, how we live, how we celebrate, and how we worship. How we raise our children and introduce them to the faith. Even simply how we come and celebrate Mass Sunday after Sunday as we pray together with the priest, sing together as a community of faith. So that we will soon, one day, God willing, be welcomed by Christ, who will say we are those profitable, productive servants who are worth something because we've gone over and above the command and the call of simple obligations.